So my name is Chicora Martin. I'm the LGBT director at the University of Oregon. So the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Educational and Support Services. That's my official title. It's a lot of words. So what we're going to do, I kind of have a slideshow, but I'm hoping we're going to do a little bit less slide. And I think it's helpful to kind of know what we're going to talk about. But it's really also knowing that I'm coming here today a little bit as doing the work I do, and also wanting an opportunity for y'all to share and talk. So I hope we can do a little bit of that too. I know that's, have an opportunity to talk more about what things you're interested in and how they relate to the work we do, because I think it's important to personalize when we're talking about issues of identity and politics, and it makes more sense. So, but I just want to do a quick agenda. So, introductions, talking a little bit about peace through equality. That's kind of the framework of what I'm going to talk about today. Moving from needs to access, the history of the LGBTQ movement, and talking about knowledge, awareness, and skills of an ally. The reason I tucked that in there is because I hope that some of the things we talk about are not just about LGBTQ identity. The reality is what we talk about here, you can apply to recognizing that in the peace movement, in any movement, there's a need to be successful around bringing people together. And the way we do that is to know who's in the room, who's not in the room, why, what barriers there are, because the more people who feel like they can be there and be present, the more successful it is. And so sometimes issues around identity and around who we are is what keeps people from coming to the table and being involved. So that's kind of the general idea. But what I would like to do, if I could, is just do quick introductions. And what I'm going to ask you to do as I kind of amble over here to this thing, is to do, I'm attached at the hip here, is your name and a basic need, basic human need. So I'm Chicora, like I said. And to me, a basic human need is physical safety. So when I think of basic human needs, I think the need to be safe is a need that folks have in general. Everyone has a need. They may not all have it, of course, but that's a general need. And if you don't have a need, that's all right. You can pass. Please feel free to do that. Totally fine. Do you want to go? Oh, go ahead. Thank you. No. Just you can say from there. Yeah. Connection. And what's your name? Debbie. Connection. Okay. And can you just say a little bit about that? Connection to?
Well, just community.
Community. Okay. I'm going to put community next to that. Yeah. Okay. Shelley, how about you?
Shelley, food is important.
Food. Yeah. We are humans. We must eat. Great. We must eat and drink. It's body's physical requirements. Okay.
I'm Naomi.
Yeah.
I would like to say affection.
Affection.
Love.
Okay. I like that one even better. Love. Would you like to introduce yourself? Oh. That's totally fine. Always the right to pass. Yeah. Compassion. Oh, would you say compassion is different than love?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I'm Jamie.
Uh-huh.
And I would say
Shelter, yeah. So we'll come back to this a little bit, but I wanted, before we start talking about anything, just to get like what comes off the top of your head when you think about basic human needs, because that's a little bit about what we'll talk about. So get my little trailing item here. Let's see. So one of the things that I said is talking about LGBTQ issues. Just a couple of thoughts about this is there's a lot of words in the acronym LGBTQ. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. I have my idea what each word means, but that's my opinion. It's based in American culture. It's based in mostly white culture and mostly a culture of privilege. That terminology doesn't apply across communities in every sense of the word. There are ways in which I identify that maybe sound very similar, but maybe someone else may not use the same words. And I think that's really important to acknowledge when we talk about personal identity, clearly. So I'm going to use terminology, but I also respect and know that everybody has ways of identifying. So that's the first thing. And that the things we talk about are very, as far as identity politics, very U.S. based. I mean, because around the world, it's very different connotations. So that's the first thing. The other part is if you have a question even if we're not on that topic, don't hesitate to ask, please. I think the most important thing about being here is that you have a chance to find things from it that are useful to what you do, to why you're here. So if we're talking about something and you have a question that we're not even near, that's fine. That's part of why I love doing this, is because I get to really talk about things that are, you know, really pertinent to the folks in the room. So don't hesitate to do that. And don't hesitate if you need to get up, use the bathroom, get some water. Please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. And if, like I said, I talk too fast. When I get excited, I start to talk really fast because I'm really passionate about these things. So if you can't understand, just let me know, and I know I do it, so I'll try to be very conscious of it. And also, later I'll put up here for you to put your email addresses. I'm happy to email you. For the sake of paper, didn't print this out, but I'm happy to email this to anyone who wants it. So I'll have a chance for you to write all your email addresses down and make sure you get it. I think I'm also going to forward it to the conference folks, and I told them I'm happy for them to make it available for anyone to put it up. So, so one of the things that when someone asked me to do this presentation, I just finished doing this ally building program here on campus, on this campus at LCC. And they said, hey, we're having this peace conference, and we'd love for you to come talk about LGBTQ stuff, about these identities, about sexual orientation, gender identity as it relates to peace. So I said, sure, that sounds great. And when I got home, I went, wow. Well, I'm not really sure how to answer that question yet. I mean, certainly I know personally and professionally, I see an amazing value in the health and ability of a society to improve when we're at a place of peace versus conflict, right? I also recognize that conflict is inevitable. I think what makes us a peaceful society is the way we handle conflict. That's just, you know, we have varying needs, and until everyone is equal, we'll have conflict. And then I said, I think maybe that's the deal right there. So that's where I came up with this idea that as I reflected on the nature of peace, it's bound up with this consideration of the causes for its absence or loss. So among these potential causes are, and these are some of the things, and I agree, Wikipedia agrees, many of the people in the world. It's funny because I kind of came up with a similar thought and then checked out Wikipedia, and it was really interesting. Wikipedia, while not research, is this great social commentary, and that's kind of how I use it. Is if everybody gets to keep changing it, it does really say a lot about what people who have access to it have to say. And part of these causes are insecurity, social injustice, economic inequality, political and religious radicalism, and acute nationalism. So this was sort of the pretense for what quote unquote causes a absence of peace. So thoughts? Are there ones that are missing? Are there ones that don't fit? What do folks think? Do you feel like that would wrap up it's hard to think about causes of the lack of peace, but as opposed to what causes war or not, you know, for the absence, what do folks think? Can you think of a current place of discourse where we have a lack of peace that's based on one of these? Turn it around a little bit. Can someone give me an example? Yeah.
Sure, Israel and Palestine.
Yeah. What are we talking about there?
Well, we could start with economic inequality. We
Sure.
Talk about nationalism and religion and insecurity, I suppose.
Exactly. And some of our biggest conflicts, I think you'll see almost all of these, and some of our most visible. What about other ones? About other places where there's been an absence of peace? And what I mean when I talk about peace, so I guess that's a good place, right? What are we talking about when we talk about peace? For me, when I thought about it, and like I said, I kind of stepped back and I said, well, if conflict is inevitable and peace is about coming to that place of resolution is it about not having conflict? And that's, like I said, when I said, well, peace for me is how we handle conflict. You know, that we come to a place of discourse and dialogue where we're not then bound up by these fears of social injustice and we don't have these excuses for dialogue. So when I talk about examples, I thought about places where peace didn't exist, where conflict kept us from dialogue. To me, that was about a lack of peace. Because I think the reality is we're never all going to agree. So that can't be what peace is about, because I think as humans, we have various opinions. So an unwillingness to come to the table and talk. So maybe that's those steps of peace. That's that first sort of beginning piece. So where What other places do we feel like these things are keeping people from coming to the table? And you had a great example. All of these things, people, are they really coming to the table? What are other examples?
I was just saying, I'm not sure if I have the right country, Kenya, where children are being abducted to become an army.
Many countries, but Somalia is a country where, I mean, there's a lot of countries where youth are being incorporated into warfare. So there could be a lot of reasons why that. It could be religious radicalism. It could be nationalism. It could, sometimes they're recruited under the auspice of, you know, you need to support your country. You need to go to war. That's what we do. You know, so there's a lot of reasons. So that's a lack of coming to the table around an issue. It's causing a conflict. Definitely. Think about more locally. Because it's easy, I think, for us to step back and think about those national and international conflicts. What about right here? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Native people used to live along the river, and within the last, I think, 30 years, 40 years, they closed up Salida Falls. And so those native people lost a huge part of their culture.
And what do you think, what would you connect some of that to?
I have to say it's more like a resource war.
Yeah. It can be economic inequality. I think it has to do a bit with this notion of what's politically valuable. Yep, and it's sort of a who has power to make those decisions about who gets access. Yeah, and that's a big part about political power. Yeah. So when we talk about in our society people making decisions around equality, what are we talking about? Social justice. The idea that justice is achieved in every aspect of society rather than merely the administration of law. It's generally thought of as a world which affords individuals and groups fair treatment and an impartial share of the benefits of society. So a lot of the movements we have around that include LGBTQ issues that also talk about peace, we use the term social justice because I researched peace and homosexuality and gay and lesbian, and I got great rainbow stickers. But little peace rainbow stickers, they're very cute. I actually have one in my car. It's funny, I got in my truck and I'm like, oh, I have a little rainbow peace sticker. That's funny. But we call it social justice. So in movements around identity politics, a movement towards creating dialogue, creating equality, addressing conflict, isn't necessarily referred to as peace. It's referred to as social justice. And then when you start putting in social justice and LGBT or any identity, you get all this different stuff around what social justice is, what civil justice is, who has access to it, and how it works. And I thought that was really telling of the ability for us to look at peace and the concepts around peace as a very global and national idea. But social justice is a very personal idea. And where do those meet? And so that's, I think, where I came around to is where peace and social justice meet is kind of what I wanted to talk about. And the idea that without equality, there really can't be peace. If everybody doesn't have access to the dialogue, there's the illusion of peace by the people who have power, but there isn't necessarily a place for peace. So what do LGBTQ people have to do with that in their space? I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Rawls, funny guy. Great writer. He wrote a book, one of his most famous, Towards a Just World Order. This is one of his quotes that I feel is really powerful for all the somewhat weird things he said as well, too. Each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. For this reason, justice denies that the loss of freedom for someone is made right by a greater good shared by others. So the reason I wanted to include this is, as we're talking about sort of this notion of social justice and peace, it really wraps up into, we talk specifically about LGBTQ identities, some of the rationales for the lack of social justice. And Rawls' sort of idea, while kind of heady and thoughtful, is basically saying, you can't say that an individual or a society can't make the decision for the individual as to what's right for them. I mean, the bottom piece I think is really reflective. This notion of social justice basically says that you can't take away someone's freedoms for the greater good of society. Let me give you an example. You can't take away the right to marriage because it will impact the value of marriage to our society. I mean, if you look at some of the documentation around same-sex marriage, one side of it is, if you let everybody marry, everybody being same-sex couples, then the value of marriage will go down. Then it won't be it'll kind of all go crazy. That's the rationale. They're suggesting that you can deny justice, so you can deny marriage because it's for the greater good of society. It's social justice at work. So now people aren't able to come to the table around access to a benefit. So let me make it, and I think this is great and heady, but I want to really make it practical and give an opportunity to think about it. So when you think about social justice, when you think about the things that we have access to related to this topic, what is something else that you think around, that we talk about, people use, that it's for the good of society, that has to do whether with peace or with identities? What are some rationales that people use? We did this because it was good for everybody. Yeah, it was for national security. We had to do this because it was for the good of everyone. Sure, yeah, perfect example. What else? Tell me, what was the rationale? I don't know if you read a little bit about why they closed the falls.
Probably for power.
Yeah, they wanted to redirect it and what did they do? They pitted environmentalists against the native community because they needed the power, so therefore they'd have to cut down less trees. The way they rooted it and cut the river off, it was exceptionally distasteful because what they did is they truly took two groups who often don't have a place at the table and have little power and said, okay, you two can fight it out. We're doing what we need to do. Yeah, and they said it was all for the greater good. And we do that a lot around things around social justice and peace issues. Why are we at war with anybody? It's either for the good of us or we're going to protect somebody. I was a criminal justice undergrad major. I remember studying all the famous philosophers around criminal justice, right? Why we punish, what we do, being the world's policeman, all of that stuff. And I always remember then getting involved in LGBT work and recognizing that we have this funny way of deciding who gets to be the policeman and who gets to be the policed. And LGBTQ issues are no different. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, specifically focusing on LGBTQ issues. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I don't know if it fits in with your question.
No, go right ahead.
One of them that really annoys me, it just is more than annoys me.
Sure.
But the denial of marriage by LGBT people is often founded in religion.
Right.
And this is a country supposedly that it is not religious, not run by religion.
Right.
And yet people of Christian religions in particular feel, and I guess there are other religions as well, that because some even quote Bible things, and we're not a religious society.
We have an identity crisis as a country in many, many ways. I see some people are nodding, kind of like, we have an identity crisis.
Yeah.
We are a secular society, and on the dollar bill it says, "In God we trust." The Pledge of Allegiance has "In God." But yet, we're secular. When you testify in court, you put your hand on a Bible. We have some very interesting ways of saying one thing and doing the exact opposite.
That's so fundamental.
It is fun. It makes us a little crazy.
Yeah.
It is the root of a lot of the issues around social justice and around exactly what we're talking about. Is, we can say one thing and ground it in this, but the reality is we do very different things. And how does this impact that? So, for your example, around same-sex marriage. So, if we get in a real practical idea, so I have a little activity we'll kind of talk about, but the access to marriage, we talk a lot about, in Massachusetts was the first state to grant the right to marriage for same-sex couples. There's this big argument about what's marriage and what's civil unions. There's all this politics of how it impacts, but one really great example of how how controversial we are in our own policies is we created a policy that said we don't have to recognize marriages in the federal government. It's called the Defense of Marriage Act. And it basically says that the federal government does not have to recognize a same-sex marriage from a state or another country. Okay? Now, marriage is a contract. A civil, it's two parts. In the United States, it's two parts, right? Let's be clear. It's a civil contract, and it's a religious institution, certainly. So civil contract is we enter into this and we receive 1,139 rights afforded to us by our federal tax return. Wow. 1,139. We receive the right to discounts when we inherit property. We receive the right to survivor benefits. We receive all that stuff, right? And then there's the religious piece. We go to church and we get married. You can still not go to church and get married, but you can't go to church and be recognized by the state. So the reality is the base is the contractual, and the marriage is sort of like that, the top part, right? So if you were to get married to someone who identified as a man and you moved to California, or you came from California to Oregon, you would still be married, right? Mm-hmm. If I went to Massachusetts and married a woman and moved to California, I'm not married anymore. However, we have this great thing in the Constitution called the Full Faith and Credit Act that says if I enter into a contract in one state and I move to another state, that contract is still valid. If I go to Massachusetts and buy cows and move to California, I still have to pay for those cows. But if I go there and get married, I move to California, I'm not married. So Defense of Marriage Act violates the Full Faith and Credit Act. One's in the Constitution, one is an executive order that violates it. So it's not just about the dollar bill. We have many places at which we contradict our own policies. And this is just one example of those places. But it's a perfect example of how if we can't reconcile those as a country, how do we expect issues like social justice, how do we expect the people who live here to be anything but feel dualistic about it? You should have access to some rights, but not all rights, but only in this state, but not in this state, and I can not hate you, or should I give you a job, or should I not give you a job, or... Yeah, I mean, that's a clear reality of what's going on. So, but that's a great point, and I appreciate that. So let me skip to this part. So, here's a good question. We talked about, what is a basic human need? So we talked a little bit about some safety, connection, community, food, love, compassion, shelter, because they're perfect. Some would say freedom, the freedom to move about. Some of these are very Americanized when you think about what freedom means, because then you're like, okay. I think what a basic human need is really important because we like to decide what it means to have access to things, right? So is the right to marry a basic human need? Good question. So then it makes me think, probably a little bit more. Who gets to make the decision? And that's really what I came back around to a little bit more. Who gets to make the decision as to what a basic human need is? Who gets to decide what's just, what's fair? So who in our country gets to decide what's just and what's fair when it comes to, whether it be the term social justice, or when it comes to decide which side we pick in a conflict, or who gets to decide?
Collectively, the courts.
Sometimes the courts, okay. Who?
The people that have money.
The people with power, yeah. People with power. And that sometimes depends on the situation. I think it always depends on the situation. And a lot of our power in the United States is defined on who you know and not what you know. Who else has that power to make that decision? Congress? Yeah. Right, they have that formal, right. I would say that a huge part of making that power is information. Information, whether it be when you're talking about peace, social justice, about making decisions, it's about who has access to information. I would imagine that in many of the things you think about where conflicts are, one of the biggest things you do is making people aware it even exists. I mean, how many people do you think really know what's going on related to, and how many of them, I love the bumper sticker. If you're not, what is it? If you're,
Not paying attention.
if you're not, basically totally ticked off, you're not paying attention. You know, and that's the idea, and that's about information. And sometimes ignorance is bliss. So information, and who gets to make that decision is the people who have access to information and how they control it. So let's apply that to LGBTQ issues. How many have heard the term gay marriage? What's a gay marriage? What's a gay marriage?
When we're having a good time.
I know, yeah, if you look at the word gay used to be, it's a happy marriage. Great, then we all want a gay marriage, perfect. But what's a gay marriage? And I hear that, every time I hear that on the TV, I'm like, it's not a gay marriage. It's a same gender, well in our country, a same-sex marriage. That's what you're talking about. Not a gay marriage, it's rhetoric. But the people control the information. And you watch how they control the information. Same thing with when you're talking about peace movements globally. What it looks like, all about the controlling the information. So I try to think a lot about that when we talk about the LGBTQ movement. They want special rights. No, we want civil rights. It's all about language. It's all about language. When you see, I remember watching when I was probably a teenager and they had the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade on the TV, and all they showed was like the 6 guys in leather with boas. That was it. And I'm like, there's like 300 P-flaggers behind them, people's grandmas and kids and strollers and dogs and flags. But no, the 5 guys in leather. They were controlling information, and that's huge. When it comes to who gets to make the decision, it's the people who control the information. Whether it's Congress, whether it's the people who made the decision about the falls, the people who control the information. And that's one of the biggest things you can do when you talk about LGBTQ issues in your movements, is making sure there's information there, right? That's a huge thing. One of the, I think really the fundamental parts when we talk about, you're talking specifically the Israeli-Palestine conflict, where war, fundamental crisis as it kind of rises to that. I think it's really interesting that people are surprised that this is not a new thing. I was talking to someone the other day that, well, that new crisis there in Israel, I'm like, we're really talking about a fundamental difference that's lasted millennia. I mean, since the dawn of time. I mean, you know, there's been something going on there. They just happen to watch the news. You know what I mean? And they're like, well, I'm really concerned about this new conflict we're going to have over there. I'm like, they've been fighting over the same piece of land for this period of time, but this philosophical issue for this much bigger piece of time. When it comes to LGBTQ issues, we've been talking about it in our frame of reference, but it's been going on for 200 years. Issues around sexual orientation, gender identity, have been going on for 200 years. The first person was kicked out of the military for being gay in 1789. You know? It's not a don't ask, don't tell is really not that new of a thing. We just haven't come up with a good way to address it. You think after 200 years we'd have a good idea. But not yet. So anyway, but that's just as you think about all the programs you're going today, this theme of who gets to make the decision, I think you'll find is really important as you talk about how you're going to make sure that underrepresented groups get to participate, is by knowing who gets the information, who's invited to the rally, what community knows they can get there. If you want youth to be there, do you have a way for them to get there? If you want LGBTQ people there, do they know that they can bring their partners and be safe? If you want, so how are you getting information? So, exactly this. So instead of talking about what those basic needs are, we're going to talk about access. That having needs isn't enough. It's about access. All right. So, let me stop just for a second before we go on. Are there any questions, thoughts, ideas, brilliant moments? All right. So, that's totally great, but I just wanted to make sure we had pause because I know I get excited and keep going. So, the history of LGBT equality. So, we're going to do, I have a little bit of an activity. Let me grab my little sheets out here. Yeah, here we go. Great. All right. So I have some sheets, and we're going to kind of do it right, I think right here, actually. And we can face it, we'll face it my way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some things, events that happened. And we're going to put them in order of when you think they happened. I know. You're like, oh, I didn't know there was a test. I didn't realize there was a quiz involved. Okay? So what have you do? And I get it if you guess. We can talk a little bit about that. Okay? So we'll start 1900s down there. Current over this side. We'll face them this way. That way I can read them when I facilitate. And everybody can come up and probably get at least 2, maybe 3. And it's okay to guess. I'll even help a little bit. Cool? All right. I'll put them right here. And I'll kind of spread them out towards you. Don't be shy. All right, let's go for it. I'm ready. So grab 2 and then guess, and we'll see how many we have left. I'll make sure nobody trips over my... Oh, you're going to pre-read. I see. I should have just passed them out.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. How do we know?
So down there at that end, 1900. You could probably start that first chair down there will be 1900.
And where's 1950?
Right about where you're standing.
Okay.
Yep, perfect. All right. So let's talk about information. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. No. So let's talk about information. How many knew any of these? Had a general idea, maybe, kind of a guess? Yeah, not a lot of, and I do this with folks and they're like, I don't know. I'm like, exactly. That's,
It all blends together after
that's
a
the
while.
point. Yeah, it's like, did you learn these in high school? College?
I
Graduate
lived-
school?
I lived through them.
Were they, yeah, did people talk about them?
People I knew did.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
But in general, we don't talk about this. We just didn't. So I'm going to touch on a couple of them that I think are really kind of relate to what we're talking about here, which is equality. So one of them is 3 Essays of Sexuality by Sigmund Freud. And we had it kind of in the 40s. That was actually 1905.
Wow.
That's a long time ago. That's 100 years. The reason that's important is because, I mean, what did Freud basically say? Anybody remember from, like, you took psychology in high school or college? Freud basically said, you're sick.
Yeah.
You're sick. If you are, you know, he didn't use the terms gay or lesbian at that time, but if you have attractions towards someone of the same sex, it's a mental illness. It's because you have this attachment to your mother or your father that wasn't dealt with, Oedipus, all those complexes. So from 1905 to many years later, LGBT people were ill, sick, mentally ill. So when did this American Psychological Association remove homosexuality as a list of mental disorders? Somebody guessed pretty closely. They said 1970s. Yeah, it was 1973, actually. Yeah. So it's great. All these people woke up the next day and they weren't sick anymore. You're like, oh, good, we're all fixed. Great. But that's important because for almost 70 years, things like civil rights could not exist. Because you can't fight for civil rights if you're sick. You're sick. You need to be fixed. Okay? So that's one barrier to social justice, right? The other aspect is, one of the questions was, when Illinois was the first state to decriminalize homosexuality. So when was that? Any idea? 1960. So until the 1960s, and they were the first state, and there were many, that was the earliest. Most states did not start until 1975 or later. So for the majority of the United States, until the 1990s,
That was deep.
homosexuality, just identifying that way, was a crime. So can you fight for your civil rights if you're a criminal? No.
I think a big part of that 70s movement was the feminist movement had a big impact on
I totally agree.
Yeah.
We have to be real, and I think that's part of this. And kind of why this presentation I think is key is because these movements around fighting for, the irony is fighting for peace in a way, you know, is making sure that that information happens is because we know movements are intrinsically connected.
Yeah.
That we know Audre Lorde was right when she said your silence will not protect you. She said if you do, you know, when Elie Wiesel said if you don't stand up when they did not stand up for me, I was not there. You know, I mean it's key. We see it over and over again that when we do not stand up for others, when they are oppressed, we are next in line. But those two key issues really relate to when you talk about how LGBTQ issues are being handled in the peace movement across the world. Is in many countries where we have some of these bigger conflicts, sexual orientation around these issues is still either an illness or a crime. So we don't talk about it. Or the penalties are for death if you come out.
People talk about it non-existing. Sorry to interrupt. But
No.
you know, some countries, they still say we don't have this in our country.
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't happen here. So what about all those people who are? But we did that in our own country. There's well-documented literature from 1905 and before that even that talk about that's not here, those are just sick people, it's not many people, it's a crime here. So you can't talk about social justice and peace and those things when you are dealing with a crime. And I think we're not that far removed. So because we talk about how a lot of the involvement around the social context of Afghanistan, for example, has been this interesting alliance with the right of women. It's kind of an interesting partnership our country has taken into when they talk about the rights of women in a country and their own role in reflecting the rights of underrepresented groups. I always find that really an interesting discussion. I'm like, you're concerned about the rights of women to go to school in Afghanistan, but you're not really concerned as much about the rights of kids to be safe from being bullied in the United States because of sexual orientation, because of the color of their skin, because we don't have, until most recently, in fact, we're still waiting, an inclusive hate crimes law in the United States. Makes you kind of stop and really wonder what the motivation is there and how much work we're putting into it. So you start to see these really interesting links between the peace movement around social justice and where it connects and where people choose to make it connect and when they don't. When we can talk about it and when we don't. So there was just a couple more I wanted to. So let's see, we talked about DOMA. We talked about civil unions. Lawrence v. Texas. So it's funny, this is all about information. So in 1986, a court case went to the United States Supreme Court called Bowers versus Hardwick. It's a big deal. It basically said that an individual has a right to privacy. That's what what basically happened is it was in Georgia. Supposedly, the neighbors called to complain about two men making noise in their apartment. The police came in and busted down the door, because they always do that for noise violations, right? And found two men having sex and arrested them for sodomy. Okay? Now, was it really a noise violation? Were they really making that much noise? Doubtful. The folks who were the plaintiffs in this lawsuit said, we weren't doing it. I mean, it wasn't any more noise than anyone else has ever made, and why did they bust the door down? They were told they could just pay the fine and be done. Well, they chose not to. They chose to sue. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1986, the Supreme Court ruled that actually they didn't have a right to privacy. They actually ruled that they could be charged under the sodomy laws, that homosexuality could be illegal. This is in 1986. Not that long ago. What that meant is states like Texas and Florida could say, well, I went to school in Florida. Well, you cannot have a non-discrimination policy at Florida State because it's against the law to be homosexual in the state of Florida. So therefore, you can't have an inclusive, non-discrimination statement because it's a crime. We could prohibit gays and lesbians from adopting because it's a crime. You can't let criminals adopt children. Bad information. Lawrence v. Texas, such a stark, it's amazing how similar the situation was. Two men, and in the Bowers versus Hardwick case, it was one African-American man, one white man in Georgia. Very similar case in Texas. Two men, they walked in, they busted the door down. Obviously, very threatening situation. They busted the door down, arrested these two men, charged them with sodomy. They sued and said, we understand you ruled on Bowers versus Hardwick, but we truly believe you do not have a right to criminalize private behavior between consenting adults. And that was the argument. They understood that sodomy laws existed, but also recognized the application of them was not fair and equal. That if a young man and a young woman were caught sort of necking in the car up at Lover's Lane or whatever, they weren't arrested. They were told to go home. If two men or two women were, specifically two men, it was a very different situation. So the Supreme Court actually ruled in 2003 that sodomy laws were illegal. That's huge, huge. You didn't hear a peep about it. What's even more, you heard a little bit. What's even funnier is nobody knew that in 1998, the state of Georgia Supreme Court overruled Bowers versus Hardwick, but didn't tell anybody. Like there was no news story about it. There was no press. There was nothing. So in this whole Lawrence v. Texas thing, people are all excited. Oh, we've overturned it. And Georgia's like, oh yeah, we already did that. Information. All about information. The power of information in creating equality and social justice. Huge. People are just stunned. One last one I'll talk about is GRID. Folks familiar with GRID? Gay-related immune deficiency. It's what AIDS was called when it first was discovered. Gay-related immune deficiency. It's like gay marriage. It's the same idea. It wasn't HIV. It was that you got it if you were gay. So speculating how do you think that might have impacted the ability for us to deal with HIV early on? I mean, Ronald Reagan was in office, it was the mid-'80s, and that's what the CDC called it, GRID. I imagine there were probably a lot of people who did not identify as gay who didn't feel like they had it. They couldn't get it. I'm not gay.
And I know men who were told they would die in 6 months, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
They believed that information.
Mm-hmm. I had to do a panel with a man in town who's had HIV. He's been HIV positive for 23 years. And he believed it too. He talks about that actually, about how he felt he was going to die. In fact, he goes, I made some really dumb choices after I was diagnosed because I figured, well, I got 6 months, a year to live. I gave away this. I told my parents I was going to die. I went off, did all this stuff. He goes, some of the stuff was great. Like I went to Europe, He goes, but the reality is we just didn't have any information. And how easy it was to shade the information they did have based on who was providing it. It goes back to who gets to make that decision, who gets to provide the information. And the reality is you probably never even heard of GRID. But it was there, and all this history sort of exists, and that's an important part of it too. So it kind of goes to this. So we did a little history, right? We talked about marriage, and it kind of puts some context in the fact that we don't have information, and when we do get it, it's very filtered. LGBTQ issues are not talked about. So,
I'm sorry.
no, you're fine. It's not interrupting, please.
Okay, information in our country is controlled by corporations.
Mm.
And they have an invested interest in how they want us to think.
Of course.
And they shelter us from significant information.
Okay.
And I think that's a big part of our circumstance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Generally.
Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of people invested in what you think. I mean, that's a reality, right?
Yeah.
Either as a consumer, as a citizen, as an adversary, as an ally. There are a lot of people invested in what you think. And it takes a lot of work to filter through all that. I mean, my opinion, it takes some personal investment to filter through the information sometimes. What's a reliable resource? What's not? Who's controlling CNN? How do I know how accurate this report is? Are they really unbiased? No bull? Well, everybody has a bias, so let's be real about that. When we listen to NPR, we like to think, oh, we're getting some information, but what filter exists there?
Yeah.
Definitely. Everybody is very invested in how you think, and they'll spend a lot of money to change it. A lot of money. So think about this for a second. What contemporary elements of LGBTQ issues in the global peace, should be an R there, we'll forget that, and the global peace movement. So think about one current issue that you're personally invested in. So you came to this conference. Maybe you have lots of things that you're either educating yourself about, it's where you give your time and money. It's what you just have found that you really are thinking a lot about, whatever, either peace-related or social justice movement or personal movement that you really have questions about. So think about one of those. How are LGBTQ issues incorporated or excluded from this issue? So take just a couple minutes and think a little bit about that. And I'm going to ask you if you're willing to share in just a couple minutes. Just take any ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
If I think about environmentalism,
Okay.
there's I don't even know how it's excluded, but it's not included. And I'm trying to think of how. It's just, I don't know, it's just very segmented. So I like the idea of thinking about how, but I feel like I don't have any clues yet on exactly how.
So it kind of acknowledges silence is a powerful exclusion tool too. But what I'm hearing from your question is, where would it fit? Was that part of, like, if it's not there, should it be there, or?
Well, I kind of look at both sides, and I feel like if I think of LGBTQ activists and environmental activists, are they doing anything together?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is. I mean, yes, we are. I'm one of them, but not in the same sentence.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Not in the agenda.
Yeah.
I'm completely new to this
Sure.
LGBTQ.
All right.
But the reason I'm here is I'm doing a paper in my writing 123 on
Okay.
ecofeminism.
Great. Thank you.
And I have found that feminism, especially ecofeminism, speaks up for gay rights. At least that's what some say.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just researching it.
Sure.
I don't I don't know what the filters are.
Right.
For that information, but
Well, and that kind of, sorry.
No, that's interesting, because I'm not reading anything, I'm just working with activists,
Yeah.
like, on the street.
Because-
and even though there are a lot of us, I don't think we're working together, but I'm
Yeah.
interested to hear that.
Because the ecofeminism idea is equal rights for all the oppressed, and of course, those rights are included,
Mhm.
along with all the other different.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. Yeah.
In that way, I feel it's connected to what I'm doing.
Okay. So there is some voice there. You see some inclusion.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay. What else? There are other things or topics, or even examples from the news you can think about where you wonder.
I think so many in the religious right.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them can claim to have peaceful intentions and be
Mhm.
part of that, creating a peaceful movement, and yet label LGBTQ people as sick still,
Mhm.
and not really part of the human race. I mean, it's like, well, we're not going to include them. They don't fit in this. Another one is there's a woman who has been writing, and I don't have my details really well, but she's in a country that's very oppressive, and women are wearing all that covering and all
Mhm.
that. And she's writing about the oppression of women from Canada, because if she went home, she'd be stoned and killed.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a lesbian woman.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any of that is.
No. So we see people who are participating in movements around social justice who can't do it from within their own movements because it's not safe.
Right.
So they've chosen to either leave physical communities or find voice in other ways, because when they do try to include them, they're not physically safe.
Right.
That's what I took from you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I think that's really important. That when we don't have a basic need like safety,
Yeah.
how are we able to engage in social justice? Right?
Yeah.
That's really important, and that's a unique challenge. And I think that kind of comes full circle to, if we can't, we were talking earlier, actually at the very beginning before folks had come in, is how much is the ability to participate in a movement a place of privilege? The ability to not buy that food at that store because you can afford to not buy the food at the cheapest store that imports from such country. That's a place of privilege. The ability to buy garments that are only made in these places knowing they cost more is a place of privilege. It's funny when you go to the store, and if you buy a cart of food, a family for four, of whole grains, vegetables, meats, all the things we tell you are healthy to eat, and then food, the processed foods, it's like half the price. Place of privilege to eat organic food that's not treated with pesticides and chemicals. So we were talking a little bit about that and how privilege impacts that. Yeah.
Another aspect of choosing what you buy and where you buy it, there are a lot of aspects besides price that matter. So
Yeah.
you might have the money to buy other foods,
Mhm.
but you don't own a car, and it's 2 hours each way on the bus to go to where you can get it. And that's all tied into oppression generally and oppression specifically, but it isn't just a question of what do you pay at the counter.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. It's an excellent point. It's about access. And we briefly talked about it. It's not about basic needs, but about what you have access to. Right. Same thing with LGBTQ people. Where is access limited for them, and how does that impact their ability to be at the table and participate in all movements? Yeah.
One question, just because
Yeah.
I think what you said about it's a privilege to have the choice often to participate in something, but sometimes the exact opposite is true when you have none of your basic needs. There are many people who are in movements for social justice, particularly because they don't have those things, and that's
Okay.
that they must do that to get food or get safety. So
That's it.
I think kind of both of those are worth looking at.
So maybe I guess there's a way of, that's a really good point. I think how we define participation is a really good point. So there's maybe I could think a little bit more about, there's sort of being ingrained in a movement, which is what I think more about when you have to be there. You have to be part of it because you don't have it. You don't have food, you don't have shelter. So maybe you live in an area where it's not safe to live, so you're involved with a movement in that organization for safety. You have to. As opposed to choosing to come from the city, this place 3 times away. So you're right. That's a great point. I think there is very different involvement. Maybe there's a way we could think about framing that. So, but I think that actually really helps, and I appreciate that, because when I think about LGBTQ people, for many of them, you can reflect on they are involved out of necessity. So I think that's a great example.
But again, that has to do with costs that we don't normally see. So for instance, if I'm working at McDonald's and if I miss a day of work, I'll lose my job. I can't afford to spend a day in jail.
Sure.
If I'm unemployed, a day in jail may not be a big deal.
Sure.
And so the risk of me demonstrating in the street is different depending on that situation. Now that's not, I don't know how directly that would relate to LGBTQ issues, because they're not, that's a different cross section. But there are multiple factors involved. I mean, I grew up in Berkeley in the 60s.
Sure.
And the people we saw on the street came from all across the spectrum. One of the things that was kind of a thumbnail was the people on the top and the people on the bottom could be more active on the street because they didn't have as much to lose if their day-to-day life was disrupted.
Got it.
It's the people in the middle who can't afford to spend a day or a week in jail, who can't come up with $500 bail, who can't come up, and so it's a major disruption in their lives, and so a lot of them never showed up on the street, although they may have been very involved in other ways.
I think there is a direct collection. So let me think, I could give an example of a correlation. So I grew up in the South. I worked in North Carolina. I went to school in North Carolina. And so here's an example that the youth who were there, who were in college, could participate in the LGBT organizations. The folks who were employed by the campus could not. Same age. They were more secure financially. They had jobs and health insurance in a generalized way. I mean, some of these students were putting their own way through college, that sort of thing. But knew if they participated in those pride parades or protests, they'd be fired for something. I think that's a great example, that where you think you're going to have the access is not always the same. I think that's a really good example, and that's a one I would translate to the LGBT movement, because you would think that, these folks have jobs, they're employed, they can take vacation or whatever, they can feed themselves, so therefore they can go and participate in this movement. But the reality was, for them, they could not. There was a different kind of loss. So that's a great example. Appreciate that.
And
Yeah.
LGBTQ people are always coming out, and it can be an issue. Maybe not in one job, but maybe in the other job.
Sure.
And that hangs over one's head throughout life.
And you never know. Or that's the tricky part. And I think that happens with communities of color, with differently able-bodied people, with any marginalized group, is you never know why someone treats you a certain way. So did the waiter treat you that way because they perceived you were gay, or because you were a person of color, or because you're a woman, or did they just have a bad day? You don't know. You don't know, but you deal with it every day, so it's hard not to take it that way. And so that's a challenge, and we do that as humans. There's a great article by an author called Microaggressions. It talks about sort of this death by pinpricks, this idea that we are constantly being faced with those things, and so we don't always know when it hits us, like I just know I don't like the way that feels. I just know it keeps me from engaging. I know it keeps me from wanting to be at the table. I don't want to be here. I want to check out because I can't deal with it. And maybe that person's just having a really bad day. they got a parking ticket and whatever, this had a, so they're just being abrupt with you. But when you're in a marginalized group, you take it, in a different kind of way. So that's a great example. Great example. Ooh, sometimes it goes to sleep. Oh, really? Go forward. There we go. All right. It does. So I don't expect you to read all these. Like I said, I'll send them. So we have about 15 minutes. So one of the things I wanted to be able to give you with one of the most important things for me when I do a presentation or when I come to anything like this is I want you to leave with knowledge, awareness, and skills. Because that's what it means to be an ally. And we can be an ally to any community. Within our community, we need to be a good ally. So knowledge and awareness. So awareness is just the notion that things aren't always equal. I think from your comments, from your nodding, you're here because you recognize, okay, I have an awareness that things aren't fine, right? The knowledge part is some of the things we've been talking about. Is this activity on the floor we did with the dates is just talking about how the impact of information, talking about things like gay marriage. That's knowledge. There's a lot more ways to get information and knowledge. You will not be able to integrate any other identity, any other experience until you know. Just like your research paper. I bet from now on, every time you think about environmental anything, ecofeminism, it's going to be in there. I mean, you may not write another paper about it the way you did now, but it's going to be part of your knowledge base. It's going to impact you as a person. So we have to take an attempt to gain that knowledge. And then skills. How do we incorporate it into the work we do? So this is called the strategies for being an ally to the LGBTQ issues in your movement, whatever the movement may be. So the first one is examine and be aware of your own baggage. We all have it. Some of us it's a backpack. Some of us it's rolly luggage. Some of it's those bins the moving company sent, right? You just fill them. It depends on the issue, but we all have baggage. It comes from our families. It comes from our history. It comes from our community, right? So reflect honestly upon your fears and attitudes regarding the LGBTQ community. Just be honest with yourself. Because for some people, I'm like, okay, I'm okay with lesbians, but I don't know how I feel about this trans thing. I'm not sure what that means. Or bisexuality, I understand, but lesbian, be real about where you are and what you know and don't know, what you feel comfortable with. And then be committed to learning more and being open to that. Like it says, challenge your own homophobia or biphobia or heterosexism. And stereotypes about gender identity. Just challenge that. How many of you have asked a woman, someone you perceive to be one who's pregnant, what they're having? You don't have to admit it. Like, are you having a baby? What is it? It's a baby. It's an iguana. No. I have a woman who's pregnant in my office, and I keep asking her if she'll say that to somebody when they ask her. She's getting ready to deliver, and I'm like, just once, just say it's an iguana, just for me. So the reality is, what are they asking? It's sex. Why? Why are we invested in the genitalia of an infant? What do we want to know?
Well, the old answer would be a boy is better.
Right. That's a good point. Culturally, yeah. That's great. Culturally, we want to know because we want to prioritize, want to get excited or not excited depending on your religious background, your cultural background. Why else? We want to know what color presents to buy. Because if you dress a baby boy in pink, it's going to explode. Now, like I said, this one in my office is having a baby, and my office manager who grew up in rural Oregon, she kept running to my office yesterday. She's so excited. Look, she has this pink outfit. She holds it up. She goes, because the baby is a girl, biologically a girl. Holds up. She goes, but look. She pulls out this little blue and brown outfit and this little green outfit. She was so amazingly proud of herself, and I was proud of her. I was excited. She goes, I thought about what you said, and I realized that why should the baby only have to wear pink? Maybe it's not going to like pink when it grows up. And I said, and maybe, she goes, I know, and maybe it doesn't even know if it likes pink yet. I'm like, exactly. But we like to stereotype around gender identity. It's really powerful. It is so, so powerful. You will find gender identity is pervasive within your movement and your communities. So just think about it. It will be one of the most powerful biases, most powerful filters you will ever struggle with in your life, I guarantee you, because you cannot escape it. So the next one is educate yourself. We talked a little bit about this. You've come here. It's obviously an effort to educate yourself. You're writing a paper about topics that interconnect. The intersexuality of feminism and the lesbian movement are impossible, I think, to separate. Watch films, attend programs, keep active with current events. What's going on around marriage? What's going on around this? That's huge. Talk about it. And when I lived in the South, I had a friend of mine. We both had cars, but sometimes we just ride the bus and talk about gay things really loud. It was sort of direct action in our own little way. We just get on the bus, it'd be a group of us, 4 or 5 of us, and we'd be like, oh my gosh, hey, did you see that gay movie where these cool, it was such a good, we just and make people really uncomfortable. I participated in the Cracker Barrel protests. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these. So Cracker Barrel had an open policy that they fired gay and lesbian people. So we'd go to Cracker Barrel on Sundays, we'd order 1 basket of biscuits, and we'd stay there for 5 hours. And every time they told us we had to leave, if we didn't buy something, we'd buy another basket of biscuits. Biscuits were like $2. And there'd be like 8 of us. And Sundays, we'd take like 4 tables. I ate more biscuits, and we did it. We did it for like 6-8 weeks, until they were like, okay. It was an economic protest, but I was a student and I could do that. What else was I doing? I had to have breakfast. Then we'd all leave there and go someplace else and have breakfast. But that's what we did. We took turns. People would come and use and buy sweet tea and biscuits, whatever we had to buy, so we could stay there. But the point was, we'd sit there and we'd talk about gay things really loud, and acknowledge that, hey, and it wasn't like things that children couldn't hear. It was like, oh, hey, my gay friend came over. We had a nice time. He wore his rainbows. We had things that we certainly didn't want to be offensive in the context of saying things that would be inappropriate for children. But it was like, what's wrong with that? So anyway, I just remember that it was one of those opportunities to sort of educate myself and others. This kind of goes to the whole pink and blue thing. Challenge your own conceptions about gender-appropriate roles and behavior. Do not expect people to perform according to society's expectations of men and women. Support those who do not fit traditional gender roles. So can anybody give me an example of something you've done that's been gendered today?
Something you've done
It's gendered. Yeah, that's gendered. You went to the bathroom. Yeah, great example. You found the skirt even though you weren't wearing one. I always wonder where the guys with the kilts go. So you found the skirt, you went to the bathroom. Yeah, exactly. Another example.
I just realized that the bathroom I went to today was heated.
Nice.
It had hand sanitizer.
Nice. There's a couple of them on campus. We've worked on the U of O. We have 123 single-use gender-inclusive restrooms now. So people in a map. So people can go to a bathroom that's inclusive for lots of reasons. But yeah. What else? You've all done something. You've probably done 15 things that are gendered today. I could name them easily. You just don't think about them that way. Did you fill out a form? Did you check the box? Yeah. I noticed here when I filled out my form, one of the things was gender. I'm like, do you really need to know my gender to decide whether I was here or not? No, I didn't fill it out. Didn't have to, so I left it blank. How many of you got dressed today? Yeah? When you walk into a store, do you automatically go to the gender in which your clothes are assigned? Most people do. Not everyone does. If I wear women's clothes, I look like I'm in drag. I went with a girlfriend once to the store. I was buying a suit. I went to the men's section. She went to the women's section. She brought me the suit. I'm like, that's not going to work. She's like, go try it on. I put it on. She's like, you look like you're in drag. Go take that off. I'm like, I have the shoulders of a middle linebacker. Like, this is not going to work. But most people, when you walk into a store, so you automatically gender. You limit the clothes you have access to. Now, in some places, they're cut to fit people who look that way, but that is not always accurate. Let's talk about the reality of that. So you definitely. Any other ways people gender themselves? Or use gender? Did you refer to someone as she or he today? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, totally. Every time you do that, you use gender. Use a pronoun. How do we assume that that's the pronoun they want? Did you ask? Anybody ask if somebody wanted to use pronouns today? I know I didn't. We make assumptions.
I did notice that your write-up didn't use pronouns.
Excuse me?
I noticed that your write-up did not use
No.
pronouns. Purposefully.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll check that out.
And that's part of, people, I get contacted often by the bathroom police. That's the group of people, the person who walks in and does first the bathroom dance, which is, looks at me, looks at the bathroom sign, looks at me, takes a step back. Either they leave or they just come right in. On the U of O campus, most of them just look to make sure they're not making a mistake and then just come in. And sometimes I'll say, oh, hi, yeah, it's a really nice day, because my voice is higher, and they'll come in. But it's an interesting experience. Yeah?
I was at the Halt at a concert that drew a lot of women, and the women's line into the bathroom went around the whole place.
It's crazy.
And there were no men in line whatsoever.
Yep.
So I came out of the bathroom, and all the women were hysterical, screaming, "A woman used the man's bathroom. Can you believe it?"
Oh my gosh, you didn't explode. People, I had to say, it's funny because when...
Did they have to get it cleaned and blessed?
They did, yeah, you know. When you'd be amazed how attached people are to those spaces, and doing that, it's just kind of, I'm like, you know, there's no line. It kind of blows my mind when you have like a bathroom in a restaurant where it's both single use and they still have men's and women's signs up there. I'm like, really? Does it matter?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not waiting in line.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the country fair. If you got to go, you just get in line somewhere. If it's like, I love the country fair because it's you sit down to pee or you stand up to pee. The gender's really irrelevant. It's just about how talented you are. That's the choice. You know, you just have to, that's the biology of it all. So whatever works best for you, right? I remember talking to a woman who was like, I can't believe that everybody can go and change in this, you know, it's a shared changing room. They were freaked out about something. And I'm like, oh yeah, have you been to Old Navy? Yeah. You know, everybody changes in the same fitting room there too. They're like, ah, they do. I'm like, yes, and no one has been attacked. Oh, yeah. So sometimes we do those things and we don't even realize it. Great. So let's see. Do not assume that everyone you meet is straight. I know that seems easy to do, but you see a wedding ring on someone's hand, you say, who's your husband or wife? It happens. It just takes a minute. Terms like partner, whatever you want to use. Hey, are you dating anyone? That's what I tell my students. If you're really interested because you want to know if you can ask them out, just be like, hey, are you dating anyone? It'll answer the question. Like, you won't need to go any further. Avoid a point of your own sexuality. Hey, I have gay friends, or not that I'm gay or anything, or, I mean, I think it's okay for you. It automatically creates this process where you're devaluing their orientation. You're saying, I have to defend myself so you don't hit on me. Yeah. Practice being a good role model. That's huge. This is hard as far as the non-gender-based language. I get it. What I want you to do is to think about tomorrow as you go through the day. Think about ways you can think about how you use gender and how you can use just a little less. Maybe even just one way. Just be creative. It's really challenging. Challenge and confront heterosexist or homophobic jokes, attitudes of others. Silence condones and reinforces injustice. So if you're in your movement, your next committee meeting or your next class or whatever you're in, and you hear something like that's so gay, trust me, I walk across this campus enough to know it happens here, it happens at the U of O, it happens. What are you going to say? Don't fool yourself into thinking you'll just be ready, because you will not. Confronting hatred and bigotry takes practice. Being a good ally takes practice. Kind of like mentally, think in your head, what am I going to say if somebody says something really racist, really homophobic, really sexist? How am I going to confront that? Some people use humor. Some people are just very honest. Some people personalize it. Like, you know what, that really makes me feel unsafe. I just don't feel like I feel safe in this environment. Or for me, they say that's so gay. I'm like, what do you mean that's so gay? Is it happy? Like, what are you saying? I use humor. Partially because once they see me, they're like, oh, damn, we're going to get in trouble. Just because I'm known on campus for what I do. They're like, oh, Chicora's going to yell at us again. So think about that, because it's important.
Keep telling them until they get it right.
Yeah. And be okay. And one of those is the last one here. Expect to make mistakes. So as you're thinking about the rest of the time you're in this conference and you're listening to presenters and you hear things, think about the words they use. Think about how they make assumptions about people in the room, how they gender people in the room, the kind of information people present here, how they protect that information, who has space at the table, and why. So the last thing that I wanted to say is, from the very beginning as I was thinking about this topic and thinking about how social justice impacts the peace movement, what I really realized is that without justice, peace is impossible. It's clearly impossible. And without bringing people to the table, bringing everyone to the table, justice is impossible. So we have a commitment to recognize that until everyone has a space and a voice at the table, it's not just enough to be there, but has a voice at the table, there will be no justice, there will be no peace. And so I think as you're looking about all the things you're talking about today and doing that it doesn't mean we shouldn't take the steps we take, because I think all these environmental justice and everything we work on, whether it's present or not, are vital and important. It doesn't mean we stop doing what we're doing. It just means we find little ways to make sure one more person, one more voice has a space at the table. And then we take a step back and we go to someone else and be like, I don't want to speak for you in my place of privilege. I want you to come to the table. Please, would you be willing to? I want to be your ally to that experience. I want to try to be there and be with you. And when they get set, then they'll turn around and say to someone, I want you to be at the table. I don't want to speak for you from my place of privilege. I want you to be there. Can you be there? And so just as you think about the rest of your program, think about the ways in which you're creating a space at the table. The ways that you yourself, if you identify with that group, are then being a voice at the table. So that when you have that voice and you feel comfortable and you're present, you can turn around and bring someone else to the table. It's inevitable then. To me, then justice and peace is inevitable.